Welcome to our session with Gaming the Mind. Very excited to be joined by Dr. Donald Byron Servant. Just a quick one before we get started. Any questions throughout, as always, put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them throughout. So whether it's for Donald directly, whether it's something he's talking about, feel free to ask away. And yeah, without further ado, Donald, I'll hand over to you. Put them in the chat.
Hello.
Monitoring them throughout. So whether it's for Donald directly, whether it's something he's talking about, feel free to ask away. And yeah, without further ado, Donald, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Hello. Hello, everyone. And I do mean that.
Oh, sorry, just a quick one, Donald. If you can just turn the stream off, I think we can hear a bit of feedback on both ends. If you can turn it off on your screen.
That's my bad. Apologies.
No problem. But yeah, other than that, I think we're all good to go. So if you want to go again with the intro, we're away.
Apologies. Hello, everyone. And I do second that. I would rather that this is interactive. I would rather that you ask questions as they come to you. I'm very happy to talk. I don't have expertise in in programming or in a lot of other things. So my expertise is from my experience. I'm a doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist, which is a type of psychiatrist who looks after people who have both got serious mental illness and have committed serious crimes. And I'm also a member of Gaming the Mind, which is a charity of healthcare professionals that are interested in both mental health and are also passionate computer gamers. That is my area of interest. So I'm sharing the screen. So I just find the correct bit. Yeah. Okay. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my PowerPoint from the current slide. And I'm sure Alex will tell me if I'm running far behind in terms of time. So I've said we're
all good for now.
All good for now. Excellent. So we're a charity. We're interested in medical education and public understanding of mental health and research, and raising awareness of mental health challenges and reducing stigma. So what do we do? We're involved in regular talks, podcasts, articles for the Royal College of Psychiatry, social media outreach, links with industry, talking to developers. One example that I was involved in as one of the members of Game of the Mind is a game called Before I Forget. Before I Forget is a first-person walking simulator, I think is the pejorative. And it's quite pretty. You can see a little screenshot there, lovely sort of pastel hues. And when you interact with objects, it goes from being quite muted to colors sort of bleeding into the environment. So it's quite artistically quite nice. It's made by two developers, one programmer based in Dundee and one writer, freelance journalist. I believe the stuff for The Guardian. And it's a very pretty little thing. And we advised on that. And I believe it got nominated for a BAFTA earlier this year. So that was kind of cool. That's the closest I'll ever get to a BAFTA. So, I feel, smug from secondhand sort of involvement in that. We're involved in research for testing an educational RPG. We'll talk about that in a bit. And one of the big things we do prior to the pandemic was at the big sort of computer game conventions, sort of EGX at used to be one, I believe, at Birmingham, and then the one at London Tobacco Dock. Anecdotally, there's this idea that there's higher levels of people on the autistic spectrum who go to these conventions, and that for some of these people, these conventions can be a very stressful environment. Also, for a lot of developers going there, they may not be having an amazing time. You're going there to show off your wares, and it may be that you go there and you discover that the person right next to you has done the exact same game as you, but done it better. So we would run these spaces where it's set apart slightly, it's quieter. We've got volunteers on hand for people that are having a less than great time, and that's been very well received. It's received lots of good feedback on Twitter. Lots of people saying because it exists, they're more likely to go to EGX and these sorts of conventions. So that's an example of some of the things that we're involved in. So why are we interested in gaming and psychiatry? We'll talk about some of these things here. And I'm going to run through this very briefly, but I'm aware that this might be not terribly relevant to you, so I'll be very quick about what is psychiatry. So it's a very broad specialism of medical doctors. We deal with all the things you can see there, including eating disorders, personality disorders, psychosis, bipolar, addictions, anxiety, PTSD, phobias, depression, dementia, ADHD. So there's lots of things. And one thing that might be interesting is there's a new diagnosis in town in the ICD-11, ICD being the International Classification of Disease, 11 being the latest version of this book, which has this new diagnosis called gaming disorder, which has a fair bit of overlap with sort of how we diagnose addiction, other addictions, and it talks about a pattern of gaming characterized by impaired control, increased priority, the extent of its precedence over other interests and daily activities, and that they continue despite negative consequences, that it needs to be of sufficient severity for significant impairment in their personal, family, social, educational, occupational, other areas of functioning, and should be normally evident for at least 12 months. And I think there is controversy about the diagnosis. There is the question of would they have the same diagnosis for other behaviors that maybe don't have the quite same moral panic that gaming did back in the 90s. On that note, very briefly go through the context of gaming as a medium. Gaming is obviously big business. It's currently, I believe it's a bigger business than film and music combined. But it wasn't always that way. And when it was in its early years, it was very much pathologized and feared. So we'll talk a bit about mental illness and the backstory. And this picture is showing a bit of the medical model of how we think about when we're seeing a patient. This is called the biopsychosocial model of how we think about things. So and so you can sort of draw a little diagram. You could draw boxes with one axis being biopsychosocial, and down the other axis we'd think about precipitating factors, perpetuating factors, protective factors. So you think about things that bring it on, make it worse, keep it going, and are actually good and make things better. So in terms of biological things, you can see there a picture of Agent 47, who's a genetically enhanced clone. So we're in mental health, we do think about genetics, we think about family history, we think about brain chemistry, we think about medications that affect that brain chemistry. Psychology, this is also incredibly important. We think about emotions, coping skills, attitudes, beliefs, people's experiences, people's past trauma. And you've got there the example of Max Payne, a man who experienced early bereavement, lost his wife and child, turned to substance misuse. And then we have social side of things, again, incredibly important. I am a doctor, but actually I think a lot of the treatment for mental illness has got nothing to do with me and everything to do with wider social matters that we know there's plenty of research that it affects our mental health. We've got the example of the Mario brothers, Luigi and Mario, where they're plumbers. Maybe that they potentially don't have the highest of social capital, however, they have regular support as siblings, and that is very important. And when we're thinking about our mental health, having support networks is important. Being able to pay the bills is important. And we know that the social milieu in which we live affects our mental health. Our what supports we have access to is incredibly important. Okay, so stigma. Before I move on, is there any from the team? I know that there'll be a delay, but the question I've got is: anyone have any thoughts about preconceptions or myths or stigmas about mental health or mental illness? Any thoughts on that? And I know that there'll now be a delay between if anyone types anything at all and if anything coming through. Hopefully somebody will say something. Otherwise, I will just prattle on to myself. Anything at all, Alex, or should I move on and just talk to myself?
There's nothing yet, but if you keep going, I'll keep you updated.
I'll move along. We'll see if anything appears, but I'll talk about some of the stuff that I've come up with.
Perfect. And remember, just put your answers in the chat if you've got anyone.
Yeah, and I'm not scary, and you won't, no one will be judged for anything they say. But here are some examples of myths. So only boys can be autistic. Not true. There is an idea that perhaps some girls will present in a manner that's less likely to be picked up. And girls definitely can be on the autistic spectrum. You can be a little bit OCD. Sometimes people use the phrase to mean, well, I like things to be tidy, whereas OCD is, a condition that is debilitating, and for a lot of people can be incredibly debilitating. For example,
I know you told me to butt in, so I thought I would.
Please do butt in.
Have one around. Someone's heard that people can increase problem-solving ability by playing games, and whether or not that is true.
Okay, so I think there have been the research looking to that. There have been research looking to surgeons playing games, and I wouldn't want to. I'd have to look it up to check that I'm not over. But I think there is positive indications about this, but I couldn't tell you for certain if that's. I want to say that for certain. Don't quote me on that, because I'd want to back that. I'd want to check that I'm not fibbing to you. But I believe there has been. Looking into that, and I believe it has been positive, looking into games, to help surgeons, and that sort of thing. And we'll also talk a little bit about, there are lots of research as we speak of games trying to, get into that space. And we will talk about that. There is a section on that. But it's early days, obviously.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and keep them coming, everyone.
Yeah, so all people with schizophrenia, are all violent. I should probably check for the people in the audience, do they know what these terms mean? Do people know what schizophrenia is or not? Or do people know what mania is? Are there any things that people would want explained? Because this is a chance to speak to a psychiatrist. If that is my kind of what I could talk about.
While people are kind of mulling that one over, a couple more questions. One, I know you kind of touched upon this a bit, is violent video games leading to an increase in violence? I think that's quite an interesting one.
So I think that's a hot topic. And if you were to go back to the moral panic of the 90s, there was research saying, we should be really worried. I think the research now is much more balanced. I think the jury is probably still out, but I don't. Let's put it this way. I don't think there is evidence strongly saying that it is connected. I think we can be confident enough to say that, the research on the whole doesn't seem to suggest that it's bad for you, which would also make sense, because if you think about the world, we've gone from a world where computer games did not exist. If you were to go back half a century to one where it is probably the dominant form of entertainment, the dominant sort of hobby amongst most people nowadays. And you would expect if it was doing something awful, you would hope to have seen it by now, and certainly we've not seen that. So I think it's the jury's out, on the subtlety, but I think there's not research to say that it is bad for you on the whole.
And then I think another very good question, actually, while that came in, and I know it's something you'll possibly touch on a bit later, but I think it's probably worth looking into a bit now, is are there any examples of gamification that actually has evidence of helping? So they've said that they see a lot of mental health apps, but have not seen any evidence that they actually work.
Yeah, so I would have to check, because I'm also aware there are a lot of apps. I think there may be some that I think are getting approved for NHS. I'd have to double check. I think you're probably right to say that I think it's very early days in terms of the research on these sorts of things. But I would have to double check if there's any that have definitively got the research to back it up. But we'll talk a bit through what is there at the moment. Yeah, we will do that. What else? So some of the myths I've put here. So people with schizophrenia are all violent. Has anyone responded in terms of if they know what I mean by these words, or if I need to briefly explain what I mean by mania or autism or schizophrenia or OCD?
No one yet, so I think we're probably good to carry on.
Good. So schizophrenia, there is a myth that people with schizophrenia are all violent. That's not true. Most of them are not, and people with schizophrenia are more vulnerable than anything else. They're more likely to be a victim than anything else. Mental illness isn't real. People use the phrase "it's all in your head." My thought would be, as opposed to where. Your brain is still an organ within your body, so the idea that it isn't real just seems daft. And when you through my profession, when you see the sort of levels of suffering that some people experience, the idea to suggest it isn't real just seems daft. Another myth here of being manic is enjoyable or productive. There are I would say there are some. I know patients where they would like to run slightly high because there can be some pleasure from that, but it most definitely can be. The idea that it is on a whole productive is a nonsense, and it most definitely can be incredibly distressing and not enjoyable at all. And most people with mental illness are in hospital. Again, very not true. The vast majority of people with mental illness are holding down a job and are in the community. It's a minority that are in hospital, and most of the people with mental illness in hospital are there voluntarily. So that isn't quite how you might potentially imagine it if you think about, things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that sort of thing. I'll move on. So, there can be some stigmatizing use of hospitals or asylums or the mental health setting as a way to generate fear, or being seen as other, which can be unhelpful. Some example of some games with mental health content. Can I ask, has anyone heard of any of these games, such as Hellblade or Life is Strange or Night in the Woods? Has anyone heard of any of these? I'm also curious if anyone's actually listening or if I'm just talking to myself.
Don't worry, they're definitely listening. They'll just be streaming. But someone said that they've played Outlast.
Oh, right. And what did they make of it?
Yeah, I was going to say, let us know, and let us know if you have. Let us know what your favourites are and kind of what you think of them, and we'll keep going through them.
And it's not to say that people can't use these settings, but I think it is a bit of an overused trope, and it can potentially be unhelpful if people lean on tropes a bit too quickly or a bit too much. They can affect how people perceive things. So and I suppose maybe on that note, whilst anyone else is saying anything, we've got there at the top right Asylum Jam. Asylum Jam isn't a game, it was a bit like this hackathon. It was a jam that lasted, I believe, 48 hours. We have to make a game, and it was quite a pointed thing where basically you had to make a game where it was to be of the horror genre, but the rules were that you weren't allowed to use hospitals or asylums or people with mental health conditions to generate your horror. So I think that was a jam with with a social point there of you have to make a horror game where you're not falling back upon the stereotype of the madman coming to kill you or being trapped in a ghostly asylum sort of thing. Anything else come up since, or?
A lot of people, I think the main one is Life is Strange. A lot of people
Yeah.
say they've played that, and very thought-provoking was one of the comments. So
Yeah, I've played Life is
Strange.
And I think it's nice to see games where they're a bit more, they've got mental health content in it, but it's a bit more sympathetic and a bit more, that's not the only aspect to a person. And that, I think Life is Strange definitely, touched upon a lot of hot topics in terms of that. I'll also talk about Hellblade very briefly. Hellblade is a game that came out, I want to say in 2017. I think it then got released in other Souls in 2018. I believe also 2019 on the Switch, I want to say. But it is a AA game made by Team Ninja, where it's quite interesting in that it is, to my knowledge, the only kind of big budget game with a main character who experiences psychotic symptoms. So the main character is sort of a tribal warrior going into enemy territory, and she hears voices and she sees things that aren't there, and possibly believes things that might not necessarily be true. And it swept the BAFTAs the year it came out, and it got a lot of positive press for handling things in a little bit more of a thoughtful way. I'm aware that the developers making this game got advice from both a professional, from Prof. Paul Fletcher, and they also got advice from a group called the Hearing Voices Group. So the game developers actually went to people who hear voices and asked them, tell us, so they could then get feedback and try and have a slightly more thoughtful representation of someone with a mental illness. And it got positive press. It got people, for example, somebody with schizophrenia saying, I showed this game to my partner to give them an idea of what I experience. Obviously, people experience different things, but certainly having played a bit of it myself, I think even just playing it for a short period of time, you can sort of realize, gosh, hearing these voices, you get the slightest flavor of, gosh, this must be awful. This must be really unsettling. And imagine if you weren't able to leave whenever you wanted and stop. So I think that's not to say that any of these are perfect, but I think it's baby steps in terms of presenting things in a more thoughtful and kind way. Maybe I'll move on here in terms of time. So there's media guidance. This is more for TV, but I think a lot of advice still applies. For example, when suicide or self-harm is presented, their advice of how this should be portrayed. For example, not showing the method, not showing it as the honorable way out. A lot of things which are based around the worry of wanting to prevent sort of copycat events sort of occurring. This is not to say, I should emphasize this point, this is not to say that asking about suicide increases risk of suicide. We, as doctors, we don't think that's the case. But there are ways of, there are more and less helpful ways of presenting topics. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit. So yeah, and I think this is what I'm getting across. I think image matters. So on the left, you've got the idea of oh, woe is me, seeing people with mental illness to be pitied, whereas on the right, seeing seeing it as something that people just one aspect of a person. And I suppose there are two points on this. One is to say that that there is an idea that people with mental illness don't get better, whereas lots of people do get better. And the second aspect is that for people who don't get better, and they have a lifelong condition, that still should not be seen as, they shouldn't be seen as a pity case. You wouldn't act that way about someone who had a chronic physical health condition such as asthma or diabetes. You wouldn't see them as someone to be written off. You would see them as something where sometimes they need treatment, sometimes need a bit of help, but they're still a human being. And if anyone wants to interject with any points on anything I'm saying or their own views, that would be grand. So this is another thing that I think maybe is relevant to a hackathon. If you're going to make a game in your hackathon, you might not, but if you are, games are just, and this is why I get really excited and passionate about games, is that they have, compared to all other media, they have so much opportunity to think about different mental states because they are interactive, which means they can do things that other media simply can't. And here are just some examples of interesting games. We've got in the middle, we've got Celeste, which very much explicitly has a main character who suffers from anxiety and panic attacks. What have we got here? We've got there's a game called Please Knock on My Door, which is quite an interesting game about a main character with depression, where it's sort of a top-down view. And the interesting thing is when you go, for example, you're just going about doing your daily jobs, but it teaches in a way that maybe it couldn't be done in any other media. So, for example, you'll choose to brush your teeth, or you'll choose to tidy up your washing for your food or whatever. But it shows the idea of when you get more depressed, some of the options will be grayed out. And there may be options where to do the thing might be good for your mental health, but you're simply too unwell at that time to do the things, even if you intellectually know that it would be the right thing to do. So, for example, neglecting your self-care, so brushing your teeth might be grayed out. And it's to illustrate the idea that it's not that they don't know that this is something they've been told might be good for your healthcare in the longer term, but you're just simply you're just not capable of doing it at that time. And I think games have an amazing ability of teaching or showing things and getting immediate feedback, which obviously can't be done for medium that aren't interactive. So I think there is a lot of potential there. Has anyone played any of these? Any thoughts on any of these?
So there's a couple of bits in the chat. There's one around games. How can they make people feel more confident when their gaming perhaps makes them feel lonely with a low self-esteem? I guess that's kind of a flip side.
I'll answer that one. It's an interesting thing. I've met, and this is anecdote, not evidence, I should add. In fact, a lot of what I say is anecdote, not evidence. But I've certainly met people where even games where tonally they're quite dark, like, for example, Dark Souls, tonally quite a dark game. But there are people that talk about playing that and using it to self-soothe. And I think games in general can be quite nice at self-soothing because, I mean, I don't know if anyone here has heard the phrase, no good deed will go unpunished. In the real world, you can do all the right things and you might still not succeed, whereas games tend to be, or at least good games on the whole, tend to be designed where if you engage with the game, you will progress. And so they can be quite good for self-soothing, quite satisfying. I don't know if anyone in the chat has played Stardew Valley, which is a bit of a darling of this sort of thing. Stardew Valley is a game where you kind of nurture a farm, but you're also sort of a member of the community. It's very sort of Super Famicom era sort of graphics, sort of pixel art graphics. And the interesting thing about the design of Stardew Valley is it is a game where the clock ticks, you know, the days kind of, the time in the day sort of goes, no matter whether you sit there and do nothing or whether you're industriously doing stuff on your farm. But the interesting thing is they designed it so that regardless of whether you do very, very little or you do a lot, the game will not, you will not meet a game over screen because you weren't very good at the game. You'll just progress, but at a slower rate. So a lot of people quite enjoy playing Stardew Valley for sort of, getting into a state of flow, I suppose. Any sort of other comments, Alex?
There's one around someone hearing of a game but not playing it called Omori. I don't know if I'm saying that wrong or not. O-M-O-R-I.
I think I've not played it as well, but I have heard of that one. I've not played it myself, actually. Does he say anything about it?
They hadn't played it yet, but apparently it covers topics like anxiety and depression. And then there's kind of another one, I guess, touching back to what we discussed a little bit earlier around tools and mental illness, kind of like actually working from a game's perspective. So a comment about they've been interested in gamifying tools that help people with mental illness, but fear that they may not actually help. Are there examples of tools that help with managing mental illness? So I guess outside of the game spectrum a bit. But yeah, good question.
We'll go on to a little bit, but I would have, before I would definitively on camera say yes, I would want to quickly look at the research, and I suppose that's something that can be easily done. If you go to PubMed, you can look at the research that's out there, and I certainly know that there are a lot of games that are trying, and we'll get to some of them, but I wouldn't want to definitively say that things work without checking myself. I suppose, but there are definitely some with very promising research. I can say that much. Maybe we'll go to some of the examples that have promising research. So we'll get to that in a bit. So therapeutic gaming. In fact, there we go. Actually, well, no, wait. So this is me just talking a bit about, which I've already talked about, that there are definite games where it's not got research behind it, so it's not sort of something that would be prescribed, but anecdotally, people do, describe it self-soothing. And then we've got some more sort of things that are, this is possibly what people are asking about. So sort of Champions of the Shengra, which is a card battler where you control your body and mind, where you're more powerful if you stay calm and focused. You use a wearable sensor. But I would have to, and for a lot of these, I would have to check what the research is behind it. Health VR for OCD, with the idea of, again, because computer games can be interactive, if you're going to do exposure therapy, where, for example, you get used to, for example, if you're OCD on cleanliness, you could make a virtual space, you could modulate how clean or dirty it is. And the whole idea of exposure therapy is that you very, very gradually, well, at this point, I'd love to draw a graph. In fact, I'm going to can you still see my screen? Guys?
Yes,
no?
All good, all good.
Hello? I'm going to very briefly draw a poorly drawn graph. So to explain exposure therapy. So if you imagine how anxious you are at the top, and if you imagine time at the bottom, the whole point of exposure therapy is when someone is experiencing something that they find stressful or anxiety provoking, if you imagine their anxiety is going like this. Now, what people, and imagine you're at this point in time, what people imagine in their head is that, oh gosh, this thing is awful, and they imagine what's going to happen is this, yeah? So that's what people imagine will happen, is that as time goes on, it's going to get worse and worse until this is going to be the worst thing in the world. It's going to be insurmountable. But actually, the reality of the thing is, for most people, what's actually going to happen is, over time, what's going to happen is that it will go up, and it will plateau, and then it will decrease. So that is actual reality. However, the problem is that for people, that there will be people where something causes them such a level of anxiety that they simply cannot stay with it. It's just too much, too stressful, too anxiety provoking. So they avoid the situation or they leave the situation. And exposure therapy is where you find something that is mild enough that it can be tolerated, but has the hint of it, So what you do is you manage to keep them with the thing so that they can then get to the plateau and get to it going down. So this is exposure therapy, is where you learn that actually, oh, it wasn't as bad as I anticipated. And then you then, for another session, you try something that's slightly closer to whatever it is that's causing the anxiety. And you gradually build it up. And you can imagine that games, games have, I believe, you can see the potential that they could help you build that sort of thing up. Anyway, that's my little potted explanation of exposure therapy.
Just a quick one, kind of on that briefly, a question in the chat that we've had come through while we're doing that is, how can we know whether the brain is active and being happy, sad, anxious, depressed after playing? And how can they build games that has no negative emotional impact? Or I guess if not none, then at least as little as possible.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so how can we know whether the brain is active and being happy, sad, anxious, or depressed after playing? And how can we build games?
How do we know if the brain, so I suppose let's replace the word brain with a person. So how do we know if someone's happy or sad in playing a game? Well, interestingly, if you've played, I suppose the short answer is get feedback. And there are better and worse ways of doing that. And one interesting way of getting feedback, there is a game called Subaquatica, I want to say. I think that's what it's called. I've played it very briefly. It's a game where you're on a foreign planet in an ocean. And the way they got feedback is that they designed, a process where people at any point while they're playing the game and beta testing, they could immediately click a button and they can give feedback with how they're feeling, and they then send lots of metrics to the game designers of where they are, what they're doing, how far they're in, all the statistics about what's going on in the game, and they can feedback how they're feeling. So I would suppose is getting feedback is the short answer if you want to know how your game is affecting people. And I don't think there's a shorthand for that. There are scales that you can do to formalize this sort of thing for research, but I would say getting feedback is the answer to that one.
And then someone in the chat said Subnautica for that game, I think.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned. So Subnautica.
Yeah.
I said it was Subaquatica, didn't I? Yeah, Subnautica. That's the one.
And then a question from the same person is VR the best way to do exposure therapy?
I don't think we can say that for certain, because I think it's incredibly early days. I suppose you have to kind of remember that VR has only been sort of commercially available a very short period of time. So it is early days for us to say, come on, machine, come on. It's early days to say these sorts of things. But I know that there is lots of research happening, and clearly people see this is very interesting and there's clearly potential. But we definitely can't say it's the best thing, because we don't know. We haven't got the research. It might be that it offers no extra advantage, and obviously VR, even though it's a lot cheaper than it was, it still costs money, and it's probably a lot cheaper than some other things that we have at the moment. So the jury is still out. But I think anyone who's experienced VR can see that it is very vivid. So I think that's why lots of people are trying to do lots of research on this. Where were we? So another cool thing to talk about, avatar therapy, which has got quite promising research. Avatar therapy is something that's a project that was started in a trust in the UK called SLAM, the South London Maudsley Trust. And that's a really interesting idea. That's not VR, but it is something where what they do is it's for people where they're experiencing distressing voices. And it's to help them better tolerate or better control the voices that they hear, and it's where, as the name might suggest, they create an avatar, so a sort of a face to go with the voices, and then you get a therapist to sort of talk through that avatar and sort of modulate how distressing, how negative the voices are. And the initial research seems quite promising. With my understanding is that the research suggests that the people who've experienced it, have had sort of positive experiences in terms of their severity, is my understanding. but I'm aware that they're still doing ongoing further research on that, to my understanding. I think also quite interesting thing about VR for children preparing to have an MRI scan. I think that's quite an interesting thing. I believe that's at King's College Hospital, where if we know that a child is going to have an MRI scan, MRI scans are super noisy. They're super claustrophobic. For some people, that's fine. For some people, that can be quite a big ask. So this is an idea of, before you're actually going to have it for real, having it via VR. So low stakes environment, and get the idea of getting used to the idea of having it, with the hope, I suppose, of for people who find it an incredibly horrendous experience, but it's something that has to be done. I suppose the desire would be to want to avoid having to use a general anesthetic for children that needed to have it done. So again, Sparks is a game that's using CBT. There's a picture from it in the bottom left there. You can see bottom right, a study going to VR around vertigo, schizophrenia. The Hero's Guide to Gardening, I believe it had Rachel Clancy, very sensible and a good egg, all-round good egg. I've played through Hero's Guide to Gardening, a game about emotional literacy and mental well-being in children. Again, whilst this doesn't have research, I mean, from having played through it, it has advice in it that I think is good advice to do with emotional literacy, and it clearly also nods behind concepts within CBT. The CBT, explain very, very briefly what CBT is, and maybe I'm going to do another horrible MS Paint diagram at this point. So very, very briefly, cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold standard treatment for a lot of conditions in mental health. And I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm going to go into the very broad ideas of what CBT is. So CBT is about the idea, if you think about you having thoughts or cognitions, you have sort of feelings or emotions, you have behaviors, the things that you do, your actions, and you also have your physiology, your kind of the actual, your body's sort of heart rate, respiratory rate, how much you're sweating, all this sort of body physiology. And CBT, the kind of core idea is that these things all influence each other and can influence each other in any way, in any direction. So, your thoughts can influence your behavior, they can influence your emotional states, you can influence they can influence the other, and so on. So that's the core idea of CBT, which does good research for lots of conditions in mental health. And maybe I'll just give you one basic example so you understand what I mean. I'll give you a personal example. So sometimes I will feel very sort of anxious, and I'll think, why am I feeling this way? And I'll suddenly realize that I've just had one. And what's happened is I've drunk a cup of coffee too many, and that has bumped up my my heart rate. So I've got a good going tachycardia. So we're starting from here, and what that's then done is my brain has then sort of thought, it's thought, gosh, why is my heart rate going like crazy? What's going on there? And then my initial thought is, my initial emotional state is anxiety. Before I then sort of think, no, it's the coffee. It's nothing more than that. But that's sort of basic example, but it can happen in any order. And the CBT model is about, better understanding, an individual. And it's a very practical thing. It involves one of the key terms in CBT is called homework. So it's where, you keep a diary of whatever it is that's ailing you, and you sort of learn the patterns. And then another key term, experiments. So you do your own personal experiments. So you keep your diary, you see what things are causing whatever the issue is, and then you try something different. and see one of the other core ideas is that, since these can interact in any direction, if you can find a way to cut the core things, whichever one it might be, if you can cut some of it, it might be that you can improve whatever it is, the mental health issue that you're dealing with. So it's a very practical sort of therapy that a lot of people get a lot of benefit, and it is the gold standard. So a lot of you'll see that a lot of the things that are the apps that are being created are using CBT as a base for their model, which to me seems like a very sensible approach, given that it is something that that has a good amount of evidence base. Okay, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move on a little bit. So medical education and research. So there are lots of attempts at this. I'm giving my own go, but it is baby steps. I'll show you a brief minute of my little attempt at this sort of thing. But for example, for my game, because research, it's a very involved process, and even doing a very simple sort of research project can take a lot of time to do it properly. So, for example, for my one, it's going to be simply testing around the acceptableness of this as a medium. I'm creating a game where it's using sort of a Super Famicom era of RPG graphics to try and teach medical students about the Mental Health Act, because the Mental Health Act is something that I think a lot of students find quite dry and boring. I think games have the opportunity to make things more vivid. So I'm wanting to test if it's something that people find acceptable, and I'll show you just sort of maybe just 60 seconds of the game, so you can see here, the sort of the graphic, very sort of old school, and you see this very unrealistically large doctor's office here, but it's very much teaching a little vignette for half an hour on how the Mental Health Act works, or one very particular part of it, and sort of teaching by actually showing an example where they have to actually interact, make decisions. You get quizzed by a very evil consultant who is very sort of mean if you get the answers wrong. But I suppose one other potential benefit of gamifying teaching is that this is low stakes. So one benefit is it's low stakes, so nobody gets actually hurt or upset or anything if you make terrible decisions. And one other potential benefit is that it can allow you to experience scenarios that might be very difficult or impossible to do in the real world. Or would come, even if they could be done, they come with higher stakes than doing it via a game. So those are the, hang on, there we go. So that's my little example. Mindful of time, so I'm going to scoot on. There we go. So here's a couple of examples of research. So Sea Hero Quest is a good example of gamification. It's a navigation game on smartphones made by Dutch Telecom, partnershiping with Alzheimer's Research UK. And here, I suppose the novel thing, the thing that's interesting about this versus the older ways of doing certain bits of research, is that because it involved lots and lots of random people downloading this and playing this game on their smartphones, it means that they got data produced that would otherwise have required thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of lab work to reproduce the same information. And this was then doing research to look into kind of to better understand spatial memory, thinking about better understanding dementia. Then the second example there is a thing called Mosaic, which again it's harnessing the group, which is kind of another unique thing about gamification, I suppose, versus more traditional ways of doing research, and that you can harness lots of people. And this is where you're using the UK, the human visual system to trace and classify types of neuron cell. And maybe I could just very briefly show you that, because I think I've got it up. Where is it? Here. So like literally you can just go onto your browser and click play now, and if Can people see what I'm seeing? So you literally, it tells you what to do, and it's harnessing individuals to sort of do the legwork to do something that's going to actually potentially help. Anyway, I'm mindful of time, but it's harnessing the group, which is a cool thing that that games can allow. Doopy-doopy-doo. I'm mindful of time, but I am coming towards the end, and hopefully, I mean, as long as people don't have to rush off, I'm happy to chat for a little bit. If people have any burning questions.
I was going to say, if people have questions,
just loads. Come on.
Just keep getting questions in throughout. And Donald will also kindly be on a Discord server throughout the weekend as well.
Any questions whilst we wait for my computer to do its thing? Hello? Anyone there?
Yeah, no questions just yet.
Hello?
Yeah, we're here. It's just people saying thanks for a good session. And are there any online mental health games yet?
Sorry, I think no questions. Okay. Sorry, I think my internet is playing up, unfortunately. Can you repeat that?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Donald. Just carry on, and we'll answer questions at the end.
Okay. Right. Sorry, it's not behaving, so I'm going to not go into full screen mode because it's just taking too long. Come on. There we go. Okay, right. Okay, so zooming through some more examples. So, for example, research into people playing Pokemon Go during the pandemic, where there was, the research suggested there was a positive correlation between hours played and people's mental health. But again, obviously, this is correlation, not causation. And it might be that people that are in a better mental state are more capable of doing more hours. So, it's early days. Rethink. That's again, I believe that's based on a CBT model, where I believe there was some improvement in mental wellness scales on that online game. Going to whisk along because I'm running out of time. One extra interesting thing to talk about I've added in, which I think is relevant, thinking about gamification, is that we can't assume that things are good, and a hot topic in recent years has been loot boxes. The House of Lords Gambling Committee has been, was recently asking for evidence. Our charity gave evidence, as well as there is a chap who I very much respect called Dr. David Zendel, who's a lecturer in computer science, giving evidence on gambling mechanics in video games. I'd say if you read up anything by Dr. Zendel, he is sort of leading the way in terms of looking at research into gambling mechanics in video games. And let's see, maybe I could give I think I've got one of his papers up. If I can find it. Ah, yes. So here's one of his papers looking at video game loot boxes and basically finding, following a large-scale survey of gamers, finding a link between the amount that gamers spent on loot boxes and the severity of their problem gambling. So again, lots of research required, but there is a potential worry that it may well be causing the same sort of behaviors that we might, associate with addiction. So I think I've come pretty much to the end. I'm happy to talk, happy to discuss anything if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you got any questions.
Apologies for technical issues.
No problem at all. If you've got any questions, let us know in the chat. I think, Don, it's been amazing to have you here. I know you're kind enough to give kind of half an hour of your time on Saturday morning in the Discord Q&A as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely be here on Saturday morning for at least an hour. And if there's anything you want to pick my brain about, very happy to be helpful in any way I can.
That's great. So yeah, kind of any questions I think we can handle on the Discord. So thank you very much everyone for listening, and thank you very much for being part of it, Don. It's been amazing.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye.